Welcome back, Terry.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, David. It's always good to be on How Positive Are You? And especially to talk about one of my favorite topics, the biggest threat to public health in the world. Slight overstatement, but not much. Dr. Anthony Fauci, NIAID Director for Life.
So who is this man, Dr. Anthony Fauci? Where did he come from, and what kind of background? What kind of qualifications did he have even to head the NIAID?
Tony Fauci is the son of a Brooklyn pharmacist. He was born in 1940. So he grew up in a family in which he had as his role model a father who thought that the way you heal people is to put chemicals into their body. He was in many ways the epitome of 19th century Western medicine, in which we decided that the problems of health were caused by single pathogens and that you could create a chemical fix for those pathogens. And then we created the whole legal drug dealer system of doctors prescribing and pharmacists filling those prescriptions, and then people putting those chemicals in their body and thinking that they had been healed. So that's how he ended up, I think, motivated to some kind of health career. And then he ended up as a good Catholic boy going to a Catholic institution. And then I believe Cornell was where he got his MD degree. And he began his career at the place he continues his career almost 4 decades ago, the National Institutes of Health, ending up at the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And so by the time AIDS came along, this amorphous immune deficiency syndrome, he was already well ensconced at the U.S. federal government facility to do medical research or health-related research. So he was in the right place at the right time, along with a lot of other factors that produced a perfect storm, which then resulted in the single pathogen theory of AIDS, and the rest is history. All of this is part of the cult of Tony, the story that he once told. He's a master of public relations. If you go to the NIAID website, and you'll see all of this history of Tony Fauci. And, I think it just falls into a story of the noble individual who wanted to make the world better by creating better public health. And he was indeed a Roman Catholic. And Roman Catholicism, like lots of religions, you have to take everything on faith. You don't really end up doing a lot of critical thinking about a lot of things in life, and you can come down to the present, and so much of what is believed about HIV-AIDS, those two acronyms joined by a hyphen, is taken on faith. And I think that says something about him. I don't like to be an armchair psychologist.
Yeah, and I don't really want to, I'm not here to bash Catholics. I'm just saying that they seem to be making that point about him, and these people all seem to be on board with this idea of a guy who's a good boy.
When you say they are making this point about him, all of this stuff comes from Tony Fauci. It's sort of the story of Tony Fauci that he has tried to enhance and build through his public relations operation at NIAID. And there are a lot of Tony Fauci sycophants, which you can certainly understand because he has given scores of billions of research dollars to all kinds of people in the HIV/AIDS industry. And everybody is very willing to buy into this story of the good Dr. Fauci and his long sleeve white lab coat and his glasses and his quiet demeanor. So, but at the same time, streetwise kid from Brooklyn, which sounds tough, and he was a high school athlete. And so it's all part of the cult of Tony.
Yes. I would also say that one thing you learn from the Catholic Church is about how a rigid hierarchy operates. I mean, the Catholic Church is led by a pope who's considered to be infallible, although now that the current pope is making some statements that are a little off the mainstream dogmatic points, people are starting to question.
There was a headline today, is the Pope Catholic?
Yes, yes. So, but basically the Catholic Church is a top-down bureaucracy. And American public health is run very much like a military organization. In fact, the CDC actually has military-like ranks and even uniforms.
It grew out of the public health service in which they actually had uniforms. The Surgeon General of the United States has a military-style uniform.
Right. So,
well, it's been noted that Fauci stayed out of Vietnam by joining the NIH in 1966 with his first job there.
Yes, I ended up getting a high lottery number and didn't have to dodge it, but our previous president, George W. Bush, did it by joining the National Guard. A whole bunch of people who make war dodge the draft. So he basically, in his story and his biography, says he decided to devote his public service to healing and joined, I think, the Public Health Service. I'm not quite sure. I can't remember. But in any case, he ended up at the NIH. And this was an era in which the NIH was being funded, not at any place like it's being funded now. He learned the ways of the NIH bureaucracy so that by the time 1984 came around, or 1981 came around with the first noticing of AIDS, he was already well schooled in how to build a bureaucracy. And then he got this appointment in November of 1984, and for 30 years he has developed a bureaucracy that would almost put J. Edgar Hoover's bureaucracy to shame.
I think another point is that 1984 is obviously the name of the famous George Orwell novel. And I think it's kind of ironic that it's such a critical year for AIDS, because that's the year of the famous Gallo-Heckler press conference. And I think it's sort of when the doublespeak really took off. AIDS was the first virtual disease. You could have a crashed immune system, even though there was nothing wrong with you. It's all based on your numbers. And your health could be crappy, but your numbers good and you were healthy. So it was the upside down kind of world that was well described in Animal Farm and 1984, the books by George Orwell.
So I don't know how much we can make of the authoritarianism of 1984, but by 1984, there were all these half dozen streams of history coming into play that created the perfect storm that allowed this single pathogen theory of this amorphous non-disease, this set of potential illnesses related to the immune system, to come together. And if you'd like, I can just quickly trace those half dozen streams.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, here we were a dozen years into sexual revolution. We gay men were, to use an artful phrase, bawling like bunnies, because we were liberated to do that. We were not constrained by the heterosexual dating. We could walk into a gay bar, walk into a bathhouse, and didn't have to wine and dine. We could score in a few minutes. So you had lots of sex going on. A lot of heterosexual sex, too, because of the pill, but not nearly as many partners. And we were a small community. We're almost incestuously. We were hooking up with each other, dozens, hundreds, even in a year. Secondly, we were seeing at the same time a couple of failed cancer researchers, Luc Montagnier, Pasteur Institute in Paris, Robert Gallo, NIH Cancer Institute, who were frustrated that they couldn't find a relationship between these things called retroviruses, which were only identified in about 1970. So they were looking for a way to retrieve all of that research. Third, there was the rise of the religious right in America. People who were beating up on gay men. Gay men were just coming out. We were the first coming out generation, and we were warehoused in kind of dark enclaves in cities. We were positioned against by the religious right. And then you had, at this same time, gay men engaging in an unprecedented kind of partying lifestyle fueled by drugs. Everything from cocaine and amphetamines to the carcinogenic poppers or nitrites, keeping us up all night. We had uppers and downers, and we were partying like it was 1999, to quote Prince. And then this is the fifth stream. We had Ronald Reagan running for re-election in 1984. He was accused of being as insensitive to these gay men who were dying. There weren't that many men who were dying, to tell you the truth, but there were some ugly deaths. We're talking a few hundred in 81, maybe 1,000 or so in 82, same thing 83, 84. But by the time 84 came around, the handlers of Reagan in April of 1984 wanted to put to bed this idea that Reagan was insensitive to gay men. So they came up with the participation of Robert Gallo at NIH and Tony Fauci at NIH with a single pathogen theory. Voila. Our esteemed Dr. Gallo has come up with the bug that causes this amorphous immune deficiency. And at the same time, gay men who were, as I said, were bawling like bunnies, and this comes near the end of the story, this let us off the hook. This was everybody's disease. Anybody could get this from a virus. It wasn't from our behaviors. It wasn't from our sexual behavior. It wasn't from our drug behaviors. It was just a virus that anybody could get. Well, in other words, all of the stakeholders by this time, perfect storm, it fit everybody's agenda, and therefore, when Margaret Heckler, Secretary of Health and Human Services, on April 23rd, 1984, announced to the world that the probable cause of AIDS has been found, and credit must go in a quivering voice to our esteemed Dr. Robert Gallo. Her voice was literally quivering, if you'll go back and look at the video.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's all about.
Yeah, I didn't understand that either.
I think they knew exactly that they did not have the answer. They were scared to death that they were coming forth with a half-baked answer to this that had not even been published in peer-reviewed journals. Montagnier had published something in Science in 1983, in May of 83, suggesting a possible relationship of this virus. Gallo's papers were published 2 weeks after this press conference by Heckler. It also only suggested a possible link. These are the seminal papers that did not establish a link, just suggested one. So you have all these streams coming together in the perfect storm, and from day one, it just took off like a shot, and the world embraced the single pathogen.
I mean, what would have happened if somebody from like the New York Times or the Washington Post had excoriated, ripped them apart at their press conference? I mean, it might have all just fallen flat on that one day.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because as somebody with a journalism degree, I know that journalists are social science majors, philosophy majors, English majors. We stayed as far away as we could from a chemistry course or a biology course. We did not know the questions to ask.
Right.
We were totally at the mercy of these science bureaucrats, these junk science bureaucrats. So we'd never have a problem attacking a Lyndon Johnson or the best and the brightest or Richard Nixon for a Vietnam War or Wall Street bankers. But we didn't know enough to ask the right questions. We didn't know enough about science to assess the truth claims. Therefore, we were at the mercy of the, quote, experts, and that's how the story got rolling.
They use a lot of doublespeak, going back to my earlier point, in HIV and AIDS. So, and at first I got taken into this. So they'll talk about how the immune system has collapsed. Well, a normal person on the street would think, oh, the person's got fungal infections, he's got this and that. But a collapsed immune system might just mean that your CD4 count is 0. That is all that it means. So you get this magic number, and it doesn't have anything to do with health. But when you say it, people get a vision in their head of what it means. And so a journalist would probably not say, well, what does this mean in terms of disease? They can't get under the skin of that. Well, it's interesting you bring up CD4s, because CD4s, there was no name. CD4 was a name applied to a glycoprotein related to white blood cells produced by the lymph system, and they only actually named CD4s in 1984. Another one of the accidents of history that ended up making this the clinical marker for this amorphous immune deficiency. The immune deficiency, of course, the multifactorial theory is what explains the immune deficiency in gay men. That is, overexposure to old pathogens and the intimacy of sex and overuse of antibiotics that destroyed the microbiome. Number two, overuse of toxins, cocaine, amphetamines, poppers. And number three, the stress caused by this first out generation of gay men. Those three factors together are what collapsed a relatively small number of immune systems. And then the CDC embraced, I've left out them and the stream of history, a probable viral cause. If you don't know what caused something, blame it on a virus. It's like blame it on the bossa nova, blame it on a virus.
So they were all ready to embrace the single bug theory at the CDC because they were losing their mission. They were created in 1947 to fight malaria. That's why they're in Atlanta. By the time polio came around and was defeated, they had nothing left. You can even find a quote from Gallo in the late 70s that the CDC was about to go out of business. So it was perfect for the CDC also. They had another bug to fight.
Right. Well, I just want to kind of shift the discussion to what you're actually talking about, this obsession with virus hunting, an obsession with little thingies called T cells and B cells, and the fact that, the rest of us don't even understand what they're talking about, so they've kind of got us. But it's important that Fauci, I just want to shift to some of the things that I found out about Fauci and his research, his own research prior to 1984. And he actually still conducts research. He is like the 10th most cited scientist on HIV/AIDS or something now. He's a player as well as the bureaucrat. And so
that really is a phony thing that he promotes, that he is a hands-on researcher or a hands-on clinician. This is all part of the cult of Tony, that he is Superman, that he not only is a bureaucrat, which is...
So is none of that true? He just kind of puts his name on this research?
Exactly.
There was a time when Fauci was doing research or was involved in research. And,
sure.
And he was the deputy director or then the director of the Laboratory of Clinical Infection or Laboratory of Clinical Infectious Diseases at NIAID. And he is given credit for shifting the focus of that infectious diseases unit towards investigating the so-called nature of AIDS in the, well, get this, early 1980s. So basically, and I'll quote more too, it was his lab that demonstrated the type of defect that occurs in the T4 helper cells, the immune cells, that enables AIDS to be fatal. So already, before the reputed discovery of the virus responsible for AIDS, this quivering voice press conference in 1984, before AIDS was even declared a viral disease, Fauci shifted the focus of a laboratory that only investigates clinical infection to deciding what AIDS was. I mean, because this is what they do for a living. They look for clinical infections, so they're not going to look for anything else. And his actual field is immunology, and his research was on these autoimmune diseases that are related to swelling of blood vessels. And his solution to that problem, which I give him credit for actually ameliorating the symptoms, that is giving people corticosteroid drugs and mild immunosuppressive drugs and making it so that these people can live nearly normal lives. But what I noted in all that was that who's looking into why these people have this condition in the first place? So that's sort of like the same theme of HIV/AIDS. Nobody's looking at the root causes. Everybody's just looking at these little T cells and B cells and these little imbalances and trying to find a drug.
Yes, I think that for the man who has no shoes, the center of his life, his world, is finding shoes. So if you compartmentalize yourself at an agency and you're looking at the immune system, you fit everything that occurs, all the experiences around you into that little narrow box, into that little box in which you have placed yourself. And that's part of this whole confluence of all these events in history that led to what was essentially a 19th century single pathogen theory of not a discrete disease, but this amorphous immune deficiency.
Right.
Once again, it was to everybody's benefit, including Fauci's because of his previous research, including Gallo and Montagnier because of their previous research, including gay men because they didn't want the accountability of sexual and drug behavior, including the CDC, which had nearly lost its mission. All of these streams of then contemporary history just flowed together, and it all fed into the myths or the belief system of all of the stakeholders who embraced the single pathogen theory. Single pathogen theory was given up 100 years ago. I mean, Pasteur on his deathbed was said to have remarked Claude Bertrand, his nemesis, was correct, that the pathogen is nothing. The terrain is everything. None of these people were looking at the terrain questions, the lifestyle questions, all of these things in gay men that could have collapsed their immune system. All of these stakeholders wanted it to be a single pathogen because that's simple to understand.
Right.
That was something the public could understand. That's something that Mark Heckler could go out and claim as we've found the answer and here's the bug and here's the guy who found the bug.
Hey, Terry, I get the fraud angle here, but I'm wondering if bureaucrats like Tony Fauci and scientists like all these people, if they, by their own act, they actually believe what they're propagating. Because I've read about this research that, Tony Fauci has built this mystique around. And it seems to me that he's looking at all these HIV thingies under his microscope, but somebody forgot to tell Tony that they weren't actually isolated from the bodies of HIV positives. And, these things come from government labs, and they're created by spiking blood samples with chemicals. So he's seeing all these effects they have on T cells and B cells, and it's fascinating. And he's publishing everything he notices, and he's accepting awards for discovering all this stuff. But none of this is actually happening in the bodies of real human beings. I mean, it's kind of a theater of the absurd. I honestly believe he'll be the last person on Earth to figure it out.
Well, yes, right. Your mind enters in a sort of a cognitive dissonance. You compartmentalize. Here's the way you want the world to work because it's helpful to everything you think you know. It's helpful to your career. And then here are these anomalies from it, and you just dismiss the anomalies. That's what happened. I'm not saying that he doesn't believe what he says. He's made himself believe it, because it works for him. It works for his career. It works for the cult of Tony to have all of these sycophants.
Is there a precedent with President Obama? It's very clear that President Obama is a very charismatic person, yet it's also very clear that he's totally not in control.
We all want to believe we're good. We all want to believe that our answers make sense. We all want to build a legacy after you're 40. Yes, people are true believers in themselves. And there's a Tolstoy quote that I think probably illustrates this perfectly. And this quote is somewhat condensed, but Tolstoy said, "Most men can seldom accept even the most obvious truth if it would oblige them to admit the falsity of conclusions which they have woven into the fabric of their lives." So once you get your worldview, once you start believing on faith that here's the way the world works and here's the way this disease works and here's what caused this disease, you become a believer in yourself, and you don't do any introspection. You don't allow any alternative voices. And that, of course, is what happened. After 1984, Fauci, heading this unit that's supposed to fund research into infectious diseases, could not allow a dollar to be spent on the multifactorial theory of this amorphous immune deficiency syndrome.
I would like to go back to the issue of publications because I did a brief research on this. Fauci has 653 publications since 1984, which is a huge amount, but I would like to make 2 points about that. If you look at the publications in which he's the prime author, they're all opinion pieces. Ending the global HIV/AIDS pandemic, the critical role of an HIV vaccine, clinical infectious diseases. Ebola, underscoring the global disparities, New England Journal of Medicine. An HIV cure, feasibility, discovery, and implementation, JAMA. Immunology, immune activation with HIV vaccines, Science. So he's got these invited opinion pieces in all the major medical journals when he's the prime author.
These are articles of a bureaucrat, not of a scientific investigator. It's as simple as that.
So let's look at the others. That's 89 out of the 653. So here's one that I chose randomly, in which there's like 30 authors on this paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And what was his contribution? Study concept and design, but not the acquisition of data.
That's the bureaucrat. He is the bureaucrat who approves the funding. Therefore, you have to have the stamp of approval, the imprimatur, if you will, the Catholic term, of the director. That's how he's gotten by with funding all of these study after study after study down in the weeds of all these detailed questions he has been handing out money. That's his power. He hands out tax money.
Exactly. So if I can just finish what he did to this paper, analysis and interpretation of data, but not the drafting of the manuscript, the very vague topic of critical revision of the manuscript for important intellectual content, everybody got their name under that, but he was not involved in the statistical analysis, and he didn't help obtain funding because, of course, he probably approved the funding for it. And he was a supervisor of the study of some kind.
Yes, you've just defined a bureaucrat. Not a scientist, but a bureaucrat.
Yeah, so he got his name on this because this really helps the authors get it published, and more attention is paid to a paper which has Anthony Fauci's name on it, and everybody turns a blind eye to the fact that he actually probably did nothing really in terms of the research.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a point well taken that Fauci leads a bureaucracy that decides which kinds of approaches get funding and which do not. So do you believe that his own research preferences have influenced what gets investigated and what does not?
He has absolute control over what gets funded from NIAID. Now, he can shift it off and say, well, we have advisory councils to help with this. We have a process here. We have a lot of people who review these things. I just give it to the final approval. No, anything that anybody proposes always falls under the shadow of what would Tony want? What would Tony accept? That's how informal bureaucracies work. This is a man who's not even subject to Senate confirmation for his job. He's been at it for 30 years. That's why he's so much like J. Edgar Hoover. Because Hoover... Go ahead.
Let me just add one more thing from this paper, which I find absolutely fascinating. Where did the funding come from this paper? This is a recent JAMA study. The project was funded in whole by grant and a given number from the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Health, also by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So he paid for his own name to be on the research, and it says later, the role of the sponsor. The Regulatory Compliance and Human Participants Protection Branch of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases served as the study sponsor and was involved in the review and approval of the study. So basically, his organization runs study. He gets his name on it. He approves the funding for it, and he gets the glory for these studies.
Yeah,
it's all part of the cult of Tony. It's how the PR machine at NIAID pumps out all of this Superman qualities of this man. He's not only a bureaucrat, he is also a clinician. He sees patients. He performs real research. No, he does not. He puts his name on real research. He perfunctorily probably sees a few patients. But in the end, what defines him is his bureaucratic ability to be able to manipulate these billions and billions of dollars of funds to direct them where he wants them to go. Not in any way allowing any alternative voices. That's what happened to Peter Duesberg. Peter Duesberg had been given generous grants from the NIH, but once he spoke out saying that a single pathogen could not possibly have caused this in 1987, his money dried up. Well, I'll guarantee you, you can track that directly to Tony Fauci. He would not allow a single dollar to go to Peter Duesberg because it conflicted with the world as known by Tony Fauci.
Right. Well, you've made a really good point, David, about, these papers that are like created by Dr. Fauci, funded by his agency, co-authored by his sycophants, and he just gets to put his name on it. All these things, it's so self-serving. But what about these numerous awards and honorary degrees that Fauci's been given? Why so many? Because I'm suspecting, these institutions want something in return.
Oh, well, they are basically rewarding him for all the money, taxpayer money, he has pumped into the careers of probably tens of thousands of researchers who make their livings off of these almost laughable little studies about some tiny bit of HIV.
There's some balance of B cells and T cells and this and that. It's all very, very painstaking research.
Let's look at some of his rewards. some of his awards he received. The biggest was in 2002. He received the Albany Medical Center Prize in Medicine and Biomedical Research. The prize money was $500,000, a check he took. He's not subject to a lot of the rules with regard to taking prizes like this that others are.
Yeah, I'm wondering why not.
It's just the way our laws are written. He was remember, he is not subject to Senate confirmation. His job is simply whoever at the time is the NIH administrator reappoints Tony Fauci as the director of NIAID. Secondly, there was the Lasker Award. It's sometimes called America's Nobel. He got in 2007. He got $150,000 in cash. Very recently, he got the Robert Koch Gold Medal in Germany in 2013. That medal actually has a monetary value of $5,000. Government Executive Magazine in 2011 did a study of the top paid U.S. civil servants. He is number 3. That's 1, 2, 3 out of 2 million. He makes $335,000 a year plus benefits. And then finally, there's this one that I find almost humorous. And this was one that he and his fellow conspirators, as I would call them, David Ho, or as in David Who, and Peter Piot. Yeah, David the Ho, to use the street language, a real hoe, to Aaron Diamond Institute. He's $1 million, by the way. His salary is $1 million from the Aaron Diamond Institute. And Peter Piot, the PR head of UNAIDS, not a science organization, not an epidemiological organization, a lobbying organization for more money for HIV. Well, they all went to Indonesia to receive as the 2013 laureates for the Prince Mahidol Award. Each got checks for $50,000 for showing up in Indonesia for their version of the Nobel Prize. It was split 4 ways. It is apparently good to be the HIV/AIDS king. They have proved it.
Yeah.
And these institutions get something back.
Well, they get this idea that here we are contributing to science by honoring these pioneers in science. And
they also receive grants from the NIH.
Well, I don't know how much money goes to these foundations, but that's not really necessarily the point. The point is that these foundations are able to import prestige by honoring these well-known fighters. It's good PR for everybody.
Yeah.
The cash is just there. I would be interested in finding out, for example, if the Prince Mahidol Foundation has ever received money from Gilead, or whether these other foundations that hand out this money to Fauci have received money from Gilead and the other big pharmaceutical companies that make the so-called antiretrovirals. Gilead is the giant.
Yeah, I mean, is Indonesia trying to get more clinical trials? I mean, they've got a huge population. It'd be a wonderful place to do clinical trials.
Oh, it's corrupt. The money, they want money from USAID, from the NIH. Fauci, by the way, brags about how he's created this international AIDS fighting bureaucracy, pumping unbelievable amounts of money, U.S. taxpayers' money, to other countries. One quick example: in 2012, the International AIDS Society held its 19th International AIDS Conference in the U.S., first time in 20 years because our law changed to allow HIV positives in. Fauci approved a $7 million grant to the International AIDS Society.
For what?
A lobbying organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, that holds a conference every 2 years, and about 15 or 20,000 people show up. Most of them making their livings on HIV/AIDS research, most of that research money coming from, guess who? Tony Fauci. That's why the 2012, I called it the AIDS Fest, was a Fauci Fest. Everyone praising Tony. Well, they all got their paychecks from Tony. Of course they praised him.
Yes.
Right. And you've mentioned PEPFAR, which for me is a very interesting example. I think that, this is the President's Emergency Response to AIDS or something.
Program for AIDS relief.
Right,
yeah,
right.
PEPFAR
It's an international, $48 billion. He created this.
Fauci created this. This was a Tony Fauci invention. This is how he insinuates himself with both Democrats and Republicans. Here, George W. Bush needed a legacy. And here, the big drug companies needed another source of income. So what does Fauci do? He talks Bush into creating this PEPFAR, this President's Emergency Program for AIDS relief or African AIDS relief. I can't remember the name of it. And $50 billion makes George W. Bush this great humanitarian.
Right.
Right. I actually looked at PEPFAR from another point of view, and that is the out-of-control bureaucracy point of view. So I looked up their website, and they had all this chilling impersonal language, which I won't quote here, all of it, but it's just jargon like strengthen partner government capacity to response to this epidemic and integrate and coordinate to maximize impact on health systems. There's just no accountability or moral responsibility in this kind of language. This goes back to your stressing that Fauci and these people are all bureaucrats. And I was really moved by this. I mean, it really was shocking.
Here's how it works. Yeah. Here's how it works, Beth, bureaucratically. You've got these billions of dollars. You pump it into Africa. It goes down a rat hole. It goes to kleptocrats and to all kinds of dictators. They skim off the money. Then the money is collected from, obviously, the U.S. Treasury. And here's the deal. The drug companies then say, okay, we're going to give subsidized prices for these drugs in Africa. We'll only charge $300 for a drug we charge $12,000 a year for, Truvada, in the United States. In return, the Republicans and the Democrats collude with the drug companies and say, okay, well, you can pay you any price you ask through Medicare, through Medicaid, for AIDS drugs, for assistance program. That's how they get by with charging $12,000 to $14,000 for Truvada or Stribild. They collect the money out of the U.S. Treasury. They claim they're doing humanitarian work in Africa. And all of the U.S. taxpayers then end up funneling this huge amount of money into Gilead and the other drug companies.
Right.
It's a scam.
I have a question about that. For military aid, like if the U.S., most U.S. foreign aid is in the form of military aid. Often it's in the form of credits. Perhaps this is a response to some of the corruption in third world countries. But if they give you $1 billion worth of military aid, you might get $100 million in cash and then like $900 million in credits, and you can go to a U.S.-only military company like Lockheed Martin and you can buy stuff. So do they do the same thing where they say, okay, we're not going to give you $1 billion in South Africa for AIDS, but what we'll do is give you credit with Gilead or some other.
There are all kinds of ways to funnel money. For example, if you are a young gay man in New York City, and you are told by your doctor you need to take Truvada. It costs at least $1,000 a month. So how are you going to afford that? Well, your insurance might pay for it, but much more likely you're going to be paid for through the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, ADAP, from the Ryan White Fund. So here's what happens. You have to pay a copay, maybe $2,000 of that $12,000. So Gilead creates a nonprofit foundation, pumps money into it. You then get the copay from that foundation. You then take that copay to your pharmacist, and then ADAP kicks in and pays the other $10,000. It is a scam. All the money flows right back to Gilead. It is a way you suck money out of the U.S. Treasury from the big drug companies. This doesn't happen just on HIV/AIDS. It happens on expensive cancer drugs and all these other things. Yeah. It is the scam that has been created to siphon money from the U.S. Treasury for the benefit of big pharma.
Right. So if it costs you $100 to manufacture $12,000 worth of drugs, and if you get $10,000 for that from the U.S. government, and you prime the pump with $2,000 of your own money, which you basically get back, you still got 1,000% markup on your drugs.
That's how that Gilead Sciences, a publicly held corporation, stock went from $23 in January of 2012. It is up to about $115. It's the hottest stock on Wall Street. And John C. Martin, the CEO, and I'm going to use the term, this pig has received compensation each year of about $60 million a year. Forbes magazine calls him one of the top 10 highest CEOs in America.
You know, what stands out for me about all this, bureaucratic sort of inside deals thing is a complete lack of accountability. Fauci's whole career just brings up for me strongly what I had looked up today. It reminded me of Hannah Arendt, observing things about bureaucracies. She called bureaucracy the, quote, rule by nobody, unquote. And that is, it's a way of governing that doesn't make the rules or take responsibility for the rules or give anybody input into the rules, but it just impersonally enforces them. So in other words, this HIV thing, it's been settled. It's a virus, and you take these drugs. So all we have left to do is to make up more bullshit language about how, excuse my French, we need to strengthen partner government capacity to lead the response to this epidemic and other health demands. And it's completely flown past all moral defenses of human beings.
And everybody gets into the act here. These 10,000 nonprofits in the United States, they get all this money funneled from these federal programs for HIV/AIDS. It funds, there are 100 HIV/AIDS nonprofits in the Washington, D.C. area. Almost every single one of them gets large grants from the D.C. HIV/AIDS administration. They get about, I think it's something along the lines of $100 million a year from these federal programs.
Right. Nobody's really policing this stuff, Terry. No, there's no accountability anywhere. The foxes exactly are in the henhouse. Fauci is the ultimate fox in the ultimate henhouse, central to all this.
That's why just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Human Rights Campaign, the so-called lobby for gay rights, endorsed pre-exposure prophylaxis, meaning they endorsed Gilead's Truvada for PrEP. There's only one company that makes one drug for this so-called pre-exposure. This is a political organization endorsing a drug. Why did they endorse that drug? Very simple. They also got a $300,000 grant from the Elton John Foundation at exactly the same time.
Yes.
I haven't researched it yet to find this out. I have no idea, no doubt that Gilead made a donation to Elton John, another pig, his foundation then passed that through to HRC.
Right. And we're putting a pop star, a washed-up pop star in charge of health care funding around the world. This is insane. So what are Fauci's particular skills as a bureaucrat? Because he seems to have a particular skill in keeping moral responsibility at bay. He must show some real, bureaucratic skills.
He has a couple of skills. He is this kind of quiet, soothing voice, this public face whenever there is disease panic that is spread by cable babble, particularly by CNN, which is the next door neighbor to the CDC in Atlanta. Secondly, and this should be first, he holds the purse strings. You know that the billions that you're seeking for your research grants are going to have to ultimately be approved by Tony. So you do everything you can to please Tony. Everyone wants to please Tony because Tony has the bag of money.
But he must also have the skill of persuading Congress, right? It's Congress that pays for all of this.
Well, they're just as ignorant as journalists about science. They know nothing about science. So this guy in this white lab coat comes before them and makes his same year after year spiel about how we need more money to fight this terrible epidemic, this pandemic, this sexual-related death. And nobody questions him because nobody knows the right questions to ask. And everybody's making out like bandits on the deal. The drug companies, the nonprofits, the HHS, everybody makes out on the deal.
And they all have to keep Tony happy because if anybody interferes with Tony, you get cut off.
Exactly.
There's another really good example of his deviousness, and that's a NIAID webpage called The Relationship Between the Human Immunodeficiency Virus and the Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. We now know that NIAID is run by Tony Fauci. And there's a very important graph on that page that shows the typical course of HIV infection, how the CD4 counts go up and down, and et cetera, and we've also seen these graphs, and it's identified as a paper by Pantaleo, 1993. What it doesn't say is that there's only 3 authors on that paper, and one of them is Tony Fauci. So this is actually Tony Fauci's graph. And then if you follow to see where that graph came from, you come to another paper by Pantaleo, to another paper by Fauci, and eventually you get to a figure that Fauci submitted to an NIH conference. Well, he's one of the top dogs at NIH, right? And there's no references to the data from which this graph came. So basically, at an NIH conference, Tony Fauci imagined what the typical course of HIV infection is relative to the numbers. He got it into a paper which was then cited by himself, cited by co-authors, and then all of a sudden magically ends up on a web page for NIAID. And if you ask, does HIV cause AIDS, they will say, well, look at this graph. It shows what happens when you get infected. Your CD4 counts go down.
They create self-fulfilling prophecies. Another very important point to make about the way the world works here is that whenever he touts something that seems to be a breakthrough, like the baby in Mississippi who was cured, he has come up with this phrase, well, it's very interesting. It establishes a proof of concept. But of course, that will require much more research. And hey, I got the money here, so come and ask me for it.
Right.
Proof of concept has become the ultimate Tony Fauci buzz phrase for, well, we need some more research dollars here.
Yeah. Well, you passed along to me a previous interview with him directly on This Week in Virology from maybe a year ago. And it was quite eye-opening, not just the content of it, but the way that he talks. And he even bragged about it. I mean, he said, and I'll quote, he said, "The end game is to get people to really understand what we do and to realize why it's important to them, to their children, to their family." And the watchword here is fear. So he's a master of propaganda. I mean, he just brags about it. Here's what he says. "The other cure is what we refer to as a functional cure. I coined that term a few years ago, saying, you don't cure in the sense of no virus around, but you make the immune system strong enough that when the reservoir is small enough that when you stop therapy, you have enough immune function to keep the virus suppressed." Now, this is all just complete science
yes, he's
fiction.
created language so he could claim a success.
Right.
Because there has been no cure, there's been no vaccine, so now let's use language so that we can now come up with a way to prove success. He's
Right.
73 years old, he's been in this for 30 years, so he has redefined success.
But Terry, it gets better. He continues. He says, "So years ago, there was this tension and debate. Should we put resources into prevention or should we put it into treatment?" Remember that old prevention treatment thing? And there were a non-necessary debate that was now essentially obviated by the fact that treatment is part of prevention. So what he did was he just made up a political solution and everybody wins. It's the genius of bureaucracy. He even bragged about, the theme of the International AIDS Conference in Washington, D.C. that you spoke of in July 2012 was called Turning the Tide Together, which would cure the rift between the prevention and treatment factions with propaganda and slogans rather than facts. So he's ingenious at this thing. He's a propaganda artist.
The only way that this cycle is going to be broken is if he retires. He's 73 years old. He is a master of the bureaucracy. He has been able to manipulate it to the point that there has become a Fauci cult, because money talks and people join your cult if you reward them. I don't know whether this man ever intends to retire. He seems to be in pretty good health. He doesn't seem to have any enemies out there inside the government to question him. I think the only possibility is to shed light, as we are doing right now, on how he created this bureaucracy, how he created this myth, how he propagates this myth, how he promotes this myth, how he promotes himself, and let as many people in the world know this as possible. I think we're coming up past our hour here, but there are two villains keeping the HIV equals AIDS myth alive. One of those is Gilead Sciences, this extremely powerful drug company, politically connected drug company in Foster City, California, that makes up half of the revenue, that takes in half of the revenue of the now $20 billion a year HIV drug industry. The other part of the propagating this myth, continuing it, is this human being, Dr. Tony Fauci.
No, he's not really a human being. He's a machine. He's a bureaucratic machine.
Okay, well, I'll grant you that he is. He's a myth.
He's an inhuman presence. It's so strange. He's like Hal in the the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey.
I'll take that because I went to the University of Illinois, which is where Hal was created.
Yeah,
but I don't know where exactly Tony Fauci was created. He was sort of self-created because he was so talented at being a bureaucrat.
Yeah,
I think it's been pretty illuminating, and I think that it's really important for people to understand the people at the top of a very top-down bureaucratic system. And an individual like Tony Fauci in a faceless bureaucracy actually has a lot of personal influence. So this whole thing.
I would like for you to put up on your website something you put up before when we talked about PrEP, because I do a lot of this discussion of Fauci in my AIDS war profiteering with PrEP. So I'll appreciate if you'll put that up on the website.
You're sending us a link?
I will send it to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's been great. I've enjoyed discussing one of my favorite topics. All bow down to Tony Fauci.
Yes. I'd like to put in a parting comment, if I may.
Go ahead.
That we shouldn't lose in all this, that there are real lives in the balance here, that if you try to direct science with politics, that really is poor medicine, and the bodies are piling up. People are dying, and they don't even know, as they said in The Grapes of Wrath, who to shoot. There's nobody to shoot. And it goes back to what I also dug up from Hannah Arendt. She said, bureaucracy is the form of government in which everybody is deprived of political freedom, of the power to act. For the rule by nobody is not no rule, and where all are equally powerless, we have a tyranny without a tyrant.
Interesting, because even Tony Fauci is caught by his need to obtain funding, so he's powerful, but he's also powerless, because if he ever does anything outside the mainstream, he would lose his credibility and he'd be gone in a flash.
If he were a dictator of a small banana republic, you'd know who to blame. But he's one face in the crowd, a bureaucrat that you only see as a benign presence on TV, and you don't know who to shoot for killing your kids or for killing your lover or prescribing the wrong drug as a prophylactic, for crying out loud. You don't know who to blame. But I would lay responsibility, a lot of it, at his doorstep.
Yes, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I have to say that if there is one great threat to public health in the world, I'll have to lay that at the doorstep of Tony Fauci. He has psychologically terrorized millions of gay men and now tens of millions of black Africans and a lot of African Americans.
Thank you.
Well, I think those are words to end on. I would like to thank you, Terry and Beth, and also our listeners for listening to another episode of How Positive Are You?
Good night.
Thanks, guys.
If you have questions or comments on any episode of this show, please send us an email at info@howpositiveareyou.com or leave a comment on our blog at howpositiveareyou.com. Send us a message on Twitter at HPAY or contact us on our Facebook page, How Positive Are You? We appreciate all your comments and questions, and we'll try to answer as many as possible on future shows. Thank you.